what the mother has carried in the process of birth gets transferred to the child. So not only am I dealing with my own trauma, but I am likewise dealing with anything my mother didn't take care of in her lifetime. And I feel shouldered with that, and that I have to figure out how she felt and kind of process and understand her hurt and pain so that I don't carry it myself and that I don't put that out into the world for potentially another generation.
Dying of laughter.
It's not funny.
My mom has stage 4 cancer in her bones and in her breast. My dad's disease was 15 years, he died of ALS. I made a podcast about death, seemed like the thing to do. And if you're sad by all of this, well, you're gonna die too.
Hey guys, welcome back to Dying of Laughter. I'm your host, Chelsea London Lloyd, and each week I interview a comedian or a funny at heart human about their experience surrounding grief, death, and loss, specifically having lost a parent or a sibling. Today, I'm interviewing casting director Emily Cook. This was such a wonderful experience to speak with her virtually about the loss of her mother to suicide when she was 11. I find that talking about the loss of a parent when you're that age is such a specific experience that I think is really important to highlight. As is, of course, speaking of suicide specifically. So trigger warning, again, this interview is about her mother's death by suicide, which I acknowledge is not something that every single person might feel comfortable or capable of listening to, which is completely okay. And I am so grateful to Emily for opening up about what it was like to lose your mom so young and how her experience with grief shifted over time. We also talk about different kinds of therapy, such as dream therapy, which was so helpful for me as I had not personally experienced exploring dream therapy myself, and talking to her about it was really fascinating and helpful to know that there are multiple kinds of therapy available in case one does not necessarily resonate with you. There's other things that we could try. A little bit about Emily. Emily Cook is a native Angeleno who has worked in casting on feature films, scripted television, commercials, etc. for the last 10 years. Some of her casting credits include Supergirl on the CW, Star Trek Discovery, CBS All Access, and The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina on Netflix, just to name a few. Definitely check her out and what she's up to. I was honored to speak with her, and I'm just so grateful. And I have not highlighted this kind of loss at this age specifically yet, so it was really helpful to me. And just a reminder, hey, I'm on the journey too to learning more about all of this, and I'm in no way an expert just because I'm speaking with these people, so I can get it wrong too. We're all in this together. We're all in this exploration of what it means to be alive. A quote I was really moved by this week is, "To live in hearts we leave behind is not to die." I'll say it one more time. "To live in hearts we leave behind is not to die," by Thomas Campbell. All right, I'll leave you with that, and I'll see you on the other side. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for chatting with me today. I really enjoyed speaking to you a few weeks ago, and I'm excited to learn more about your story. And I would love for anyone who doesn't know you, if you don't mind introducing yourself, where you're from, a little bit about your background and what brings you here today.
I am Emily Cook. I'm a native Angeleno, and I currently work in casting for TV and film, which I've been doing for about a decade. I'm here today to speak with you primarily because I lost my mother when I was 11 years old due to suicide.
Thank you for opening up about that. And
Yeah.
I think people are going to really appreciate and look forward to hearing your story, as weird as that wording is. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate getting to speak with you a little bit more. And one of the first questions I usually ask people on the podcast is telling me about your goldfish moment. And your goldfish moment is the first time you thought about or conceptualized death in some way. For some people, it was their goldfish.
Goldfish moment. Did your goldfish die? Goldfish moment. Did it make you cry?
I'm curious what comes up for you around that.
I lost my grandfather. He passed away, I think, when I was like 8 years old. And I'm not sure I truly understood what it meant. At the time, it was odd because I found out and I was just kind of excited that I didn't have to go to school. But I know that was like the first major death I experienced. I don't know if it really hit me that I would never see him again when it occurred, simply because I was young and it wasn't feasible in my mind. I didn't attend the funeral or anything. Maybe it would have been a little more real had that happened. But that's what I would say was my goldfish moment.
Yeah, do you remember at the time, I'm curious if it was something that was talked about with your other family members or how it was addressed in your household?
Oh, that's an interesting thing. I think my family has a tendency to not really sit with the uncomfortable feelings. And I think this was kind of an example of that maybe it wasn't explained to me properly that my grandfather was gone. He battled brain cancer. And so I had seen him when he was going through treatment, and eventually he decided to not pursue treatment anymore and let nature have its way. But I saw him and he lost his ability to speak. He was using an Etch-a-Sketch to write out words that the things he wanted. But even then, it wasn't, I don't think I really had a sense of like, this is the last time we're going to see Grandpa. Grandpa's not going to be here anymore. It was just kind of like, we're seeing Grandpa and things are a little different.
I remember losing one of my grandparents young too. And it's interesting as a young person, not having the same thoughts about finality and that permanency. It's almost like when you're young, that ability to bounce back from deep and dark things. It's like a cloud that kind of lifts as you get older. I resonate with what you're saying about the family not necessarily being as open. I've noticed, our generation is a lot more open about things like death than generations above us. I'm curious to learn more about your journey with grief, specifically with your mom, of course, which is why we're here today. And if you don't mind walking us through what that was like for you at that time, that must have been really difficult. You're very young, and I appreciate you sharing about it.
Absolutely. Me and my mom were very tight. I was kind of like her mini-me, and she was very, very glad to have me. And since her passing, many people have told me that I was the one true joy in her life, being the only child. She and I spent a lot of time together, just the two of us growing up. At age 7, my parents separated, and then later divorced. I would say about 2-3 years later, my father remarried, and a year after he got remarried, my little brother was born, my half-brother. And then about 2 months after that, my mother, who had been dealing with opioid addiction, severe depression, decided to take her own life. But I was 11 at the time, so I didn't realize everything that had been going on with her. And it's only been through deep investigation of her history over the past more than 20 years have I figured out that she had been dealing with disorder, and that she had attempted suicide starting in her teen years. None of this I was aware of at age 11. It was an odd, I'm pausing because even though this is something I've recounted many times, it was an odd thing that she did. She had prepared for a couple days to take her own life. she had attempted suicide when I was alive and didn't really have comprehension of what that was. And primarily, she tried through overdosing, and um, that hadn't succeeded. I guess succeeding is passing away. Um, so she took different measures this time, and um, she got a handgun from a friend. Um, I believe it was previously hers, and she said she was going to pawn it. But I was with her when she got it back from her friend, and then that was the week prior. And then she passed away on Monday, April 13th, 1998. And on the Thursday beforehand, she sat me down as we were watching NBC Thursday night television. And she said, "How would you feel if I went away for a while?" And I had no clue what she meant. I thought maybe she was going on a trip. I was just not connected with what she was saying at all. And I think, in a way, she was asking me for permission to leave, to never be seen again. She asked me if I would be okay with my dad and how I liked my stepmother and things like that. And I don't know if I thought about it. I don't know if I would have answered any differently had I known what she was truly asking me. But I just had no idea what she was asking me. We spent the rest of the weekend together. Monday morning, I was supposed to go back to school. It was a transfer. So that afternoon, I would be back at my father's house. She wanted to take me to school. And her boyfriend, who was living with us, said, "No, I'll take Emily." And he had to do some stuff around the house before we set off. So she held me very closely on an ottoman. Maybe she got emotional. I don't know. But that was the last time I saw her.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to you for sharing. And, I don't have the right words, but I'm sorry you had that experience. And you are really articulate, and I'm sure it must be hard to think about that. And I'm wondering, what was it like for you at that time, being close to your mom and then being 11? I'm sure there's other people listening who may have lost a parent in a similar way at a similar age or both. And I'm curious what that experience was like for you and following that.
Because me and my mother were close, and because she kept me very close, as close as she could, considering that there was a custody battle going on over me. The state had decided that she was not a suitable mother, so for several years I had it was mandatory that she have someone supervise my time spent with her. That ended as time went on, and I'm not sure why. It's not that she got particularly better. Maybe it was because she was living with her boyfriend and he was considered a suitable overseer for what was going on. But I apologize. I lost my train of thought.
Oh, no, that's okay. I guess I wonder, was there someone that you were able to talk to around that time, whether it was another family member, friend, or role model? And, some people don't, and that's okay if you didn't, but I'm just curious, like, what your outlet was around that time.
Um, I'll try answering it this way. um, when I got home from school that afternoon, my father was unexpectedly at home and took me aside to tell me that my mother had passed away, and my world collapsed. I didn't understand what was going on at all. I think I had a moment of just probably a blank stare and then crying my eyes out. When I couldn't do that anymore, it was a matter of me sitting with my dad and my stepmom and just kind of trying to understand what my world was. I think maybe I had a call with a therapist I was seeing at the time. But in addition to that, that evening, my family placed a lot of calls to friends and family, and I think looking back, it was a poor decision. But my father had me place the phone call to his mother to tell her that my mother had passed away. Then I heard my grandmother wail and cry that her former daughter-in-law had passed. So recommendation is don't have the kids make the announcement calls.
Fair, absolutely fair.
Yeah, don't have your kids do that. You're supposed to be in a manner of protecting them, and that didn't feel like a safe thing. Yeah. Over the years, I have been very fortunate to have my godmother, and I only call her my godmother because I don't know what else. It's not a religious thing. It's just, she was my mother's dear friend, and it always been a mother type figure to me. She and my mother were pregnant together, had kids 3 months apart. So she's been a huge source of aid in my life, and used to take me out on the anniversary of my mom's death to the restaurant that my mother loved the most, and we would sit around and share memories of my mom. And that's been a blessing.
Mm-hmm. And you guys are still close, it sounds like.
Oh, yeah. During this quarantine, last week I went over and had dinner in her backyard, social distancing and everything. She and I speak weekly, if not more often than that.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And she always feels like a safe place where I can go to with the revelations I've had about my mother. And she'll agree and disagree with me on things that I've said about my mom. But I think it feels good just to have someone sit and listen and not necessarily tell you what their thoughts are, but just someone who will say, I'm here, let's do it, we'll figure it out.
Yeah, I love that. I love what you're saying about having that safe space for someone to listen. I think there's a lot of tendencies with many things in life for people to relate it back to themselves and reflect back with their own thoughts and advice. And it's healthy a little bit, but there's definitely a balance that I find not everyone strikes quite right, especially with grief and death. You're like, oh, have you even, I'm not going to judge you, but you haven't lost anyone. Just kidding. Judgment not coming out. But people are trying to help, but it's not always helpful. So speaking of listening, let's listen to you again.
No, I just want to echo what you're saying, that I think people feel uncomfortable with death, and there's often a feeling like I need to say something to fill the space, to make someone feel better. I need to be moving and be in action, and it's not that. I think letting people sit with their feelings can be really positive, and letting them have the space. I know some people feel the need to be busy when they're dealing with grief, and just sitting back with it, I think, will save you a lot of time in the future to sit with your feelings when it happens.
That's powerful, and that's a good reminder. did you find that sitting with your grief at the time was helpful? And since you were quite young, I'm curious what your experience of sitting with grief has been like for you over the years.
As a child, I really didn't get the opportunity to sit with my grief.
Mm-hmm.
Around my mother's passing, we had a bunch of family come in. Arrangements were made. I've come from a Jewish background, so we put our people in the ground very quickly. I think she was buried. My mother passed away on Monday. She was buried by like Thursday, Friday, and I think on Saturday, because we had family in town, we all went to Disneyland, which I think is really screwy now. Like, that's not sitting with it. That's distraction. That's putting a gloss over it to make sure everything's okay. So I think part of my journey is understanding that I want to do things differently than the way I was raised. And that's really taken me a long time to understand that sitting with feelings instead of burying them is monumental. To address things in the moment is far superior to figuring out why you're angry or sad, a week later or a month later or 10 years later. When you shove it down, it festers and it turns into something much harder to handle, and occasionally something gangrenous, perhaps, could be a word used to describe it. I think it's important for someone who's dealing with suffering is just to listen. And you don't have to do the active listening of like, I hear you and let me say back to you what I'm hearing from you, because I think we're all taught that. I don't know if you went through that. I'm hearing some laughter on your behalf.
Yeah, I resonate because it's funny. It's like the people doing that, I'm like, well, I guess I'd prefer that than them just like blabbering on. But I also know what you mean. It becomes like, it's not funny, but it's funny, but it's awkward, but it's like they're trying. Yeah, all the things. Go on.
No, it is a concerted effort, and I appreciate the concerted effort that you are trying to be a good listener. But I think by trying to say, I hear you, the focus is on, let me show you that I'm listening instead of listening. If you're caught up in the how do I say the right thing, it takes away from your capacity to listen. But if it feels comfortable to say, like, if that's ingrained in who you are, like, by all means, go for that. But you can see it from a mile away when people are like, I'm trying to be here for you.
Right. Yeah, I'm nodding. I'm trying to listen. I'm like, okay, I'm listening by nodding. She can't see the nod. How do I convey that I'm listening? And suddenly I just became that person. So shout out to me. No. But have there been people in your life as a young adult that have been particularly good listeners, and what other advice would you have for people supporting those who have lost someone on how they can be a better listener?
I think it's a matter, you don't have to try so hard. During quarantine, I reflected on one of my oldest friends, who I've known since I was at least like 5 years old, if not younger. And she attended my mother's funeral, and I wrote her this note, and we've talked about it since. But, we were 11. She took me aside during my mother's funeral. She didn't know how to talk to me about anything. She wasn't trained. And she just kind of sat with me, and she said, like, Emily, I know your mom's gone. I'll share my mom with you. And that warms my heart to this day. Like, you can share your mom with me and like in a certain capacity, like, but it was just this, it really felt like she was reaching out to me. I mean, we were both 11, didn't know what to do, but that felt like true care.
Are you guys still close?
Oh, yeah. We're close. Yeah.
That's really wise of her and kind. And I really like that memory that you shared about that. Like, it is heartwarming, and it's interesting. At the time, you never know what the things are that someone will say that you'll remember the rest of your life. So I think that's cool to reflect back and be like, hey, that was one of them. And
yeah, I can't remember much else of what anyone else told me that day, but I remember that particularly.
What was it like in middle school and high school without your mom? And what was it like speaking with kids at school about it, if any memories come to mind about that?
School was tough. School was really tough. Because I was consulted by a therapist to not say that my mom had committed suicide, that it was something that was taboo. Mm-hmm. And so I was guided into saying, if someone ever asked about my mom, I was told by my therapist to say that my mother had been sick for a very long time, that would defend me against probing questions, and that it was enough to give people kind of this, like, you know what, don't dig there vibe. And it shut them down, and it made it so that I didn't have conversations with people about what had happened. And I think that is not helpful. It was maybe the predominant logic at the time, but I think by today's standards, it would be more beneficial to be truthful about it. I'm still on guard when I tell people about it. And it still feels like a very personal thing that I don't just outright tell people from the get-go. Doing a podcast about it is a little bit of a different matter.
True.
Yeah. But it always felt like this big secret that I would let people in on when they got to know me well. Besides that, I didn't talk about my mom. It was like, if you know my mom committed suicide, that means you're in my inner circle. And I don't think it has to be that way at all. There's no reason to keep it so secret. Not that I'm like parading around the streets by any means saying this happened to me, but I think there's other ways to develop intimacy besides saying like, this is the absolute worst thing that happened to me in my life. As for school, it was tough. I took a week away from school and returned exactly a week after my mother had passed. My teachers had gotten a note saying that my mother had committed suicide, and by accident, my math teacher had read it aloud to the class.
No, what? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to have that reaction, but I'm like, oh, you poor. Wait, like, what does that even mean? Okay, what does that? She just accidentally read it? Like,
to my understanding, I mean, this was many years ago, but I came back and in homeroom, some girls were asking me, like, where have you been for the past week? And I didn't want to talk to them about it. I wanted to just push it under the rug as I had been taught. But it was, I think they knew. Mm-hmm. I think they knew, and they were probing me for, like, where have you been? What's going on? And I eventually revealed to them what, my mom died. And, we were sixth graders. They were not there being compassionate. I think they were there, and I don't fault them. When you're tween, you're very curious. But I felt like they were searching for answers about what was going on with me and not truly coming at it from a compassionate point. So, yeah, that was not a great move on my teacher's part.
Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah, I didn't have any control over that. But, I think people just didn't know. Didn't know what to do with that sort of information.
It's interesting you say that about the questions, because, that's something that in my grief counseling world that I volunteer in, they say that's such a delicate balance because there's questions to be asked that paint more of a picture that is helpful and also helpful for the person you're asking to get it out, who have all these bottled up emotions. And it's actually, healthy to talk about it, and we're normalizing death and grief. But then there are questions that, like you're saying, are not necessarily coming from a compassionate place, or they're just coming from a place of curiosity, which isn't bad, but it's not helpful. And straddling that line is interesting. And especially for, that age is a whole other story. And they're just like, that's the age you ask everyone everything about, like, oh, like, your legs are hairy. Why? You just ask all these weird things, or at least some people do. So I'm sorry you had to answer to them.
I think it's one of those things that the longer you have been dealing with your grief, the more comfortable you perhaps become with the curious questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you just learn how to navigate them differently. I'm not offended by them anymore when people ask me curious questions, simply because I've had so long to sit with my stuff and I'm not as uncomfortable with it. But I think, one, it was being between and answering, and two, such new information for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I would understand if someone recently lost someone close to them and they were defensive about curious questions, even if they were like in their 50s to 90s. It's still just fresh.
Yeah, I'm curious, what advice I love how we're like, curious questions are not helpful. And then I just started my next question. I'm curious about, it's like, there we go. But I wonder.
I'm not taking offense. I've been dealing with it, so we're good.
You're like, I'm ready for this. This is what I said, Chelsea. I'm ready. And I wonder what advice you would have for someone who has recently lost a parent to suicide. Like, if anyone is listening, what's something that you would say to them?
Oh, I would tell someone who lost someone to suicide recently that whatever they're feeling, it's legitimate. Just legitimate. Like, no need to argue with them saying you can't feel this way or you shouldn't feel this way or be fortunate for the time that you have with them. No. Like, whatever you're going through, if you want to talk about the 5 stages of grief or you want to talk about anything else, if you're weirdly feeling good on a certain day, like, that's fine. All of it is so fine. You don't have to figure out why you're feeling away, and it's okay to just let these things happen.
I love that. That's beautiful. I appreciate that. And my follow-up question would be, what about suicide do you wish that other people knew?
It's not so much what I wish they knew about it. I think we all know it's something that exists and that it comes from someone not feeling good about themselves. But I do wish people would not make it such a taboo thing. And I think that just comes with time and exposure.
Absolutely. I think it could start at a younger age. Like you're saying, in school, kids now, a few schools have more grief awareness, but even so, I'm sure it's still far from being in the regular curriculum, and how that can influence someone's perspective on death and suicide specifically with more exposure, like you're saying. That's a good point.
I think it's not a matter of frequency of exposure. Don't feel like children need to be repeatedly reminded that people die and that suicide happens and that depression is out there. I think it's having a open stance on it where it comes from a place of understanding that it happens and not rushing to say it's bad. Just coming from a place of like, it happens, so that you don't have all these negative associations with it that you carry throughout your life and then have to undo.
I'm curious if you've had experiences with a therapist as you've gotten older that have been positive or helpful in some way.
I cannot express enough how important it is for someone to have a professional outside source and their perspective on what you're going through. I think exclusively speaking to people who have a say in your life is difficult because they have. I think it's vitally important for someone to have an outside source weigh in on their life, and a therapist is vital in that regard. Someone who is unbiased and who will see things without their own life being affected by it. I think when you talk to friends, they want you to get better so that things can be better for them as well. And I think, and they're coming at it from their own hurts and pain. And with a therapist, someone who's professionally trained can view it from perspective instead of their perspective is immensely helpful. I currently go to dream therapy, which helps access the subconscious, and I found that immensely helpful. And the person I see has a huge focus on the relationship, whether male or female, whether the client is male or female, with their mother, and understanding that what the mother has carried in the process of birth gets transferred to the child. So not only am I dealing with my own trauma, but I am likewise dealing with anything my mother didn't take care of in her lifetime. And I feel shouldered with that, and that I have to figure out how she felt and kind of process and understand her hurt and pain so that I don't carry it myself and that I don't put that out into the world for potentially another generation.
Yeah, dream therapy sounds really interesting, and it's not something that I've done. So I'm curious if you could share what that has been like for you versus other kinds of therapy.
I find it useful. I've done a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is, I think, what people traditionally think of when they think of modern day therapy, which is identifying thinking mistakes and trying to recognize what their belief is versus what shared reality is, and trying to understand that their perceptions are coming from a place of emotional stuff. I think cognitive behavioral is beneficial, but I think that dealing with dreams and subconsciousness gets to the root of the issue instead of finding fixes around it, so that you get to the root of it, pull out what's feeling bad instead of learning ways to cope with what's feeling bad. I bring a dream in each week, and having the relationship that I have with my therapist, which has been ongoing for quite a long time, she has a back knowledge of my history, and we pick out certain things that occur in the dream and kind of dissect what that means to me personally and develop a story together of what it means and what I'm trying to tell myself, whether it's positive or negative.
I really think that's fascinating. I would be interested in I would be interested in experiencing something like that. So thanks for mentioning that. I think it's so important to remind people that there are different options when it comes to therapy, not just one, but many versions. So it's really cool that you found something that works for you.
It was uncomfortable at first, but for me, it's what I recommend to other people now.
Wow. So, yeah, if people Google like dream therapists in their area, I'm sure something will come up. And yeah, maybe that will inspire someone who has not necessarily found luck or success or in cognitive, it's called cognitive behavioral therapy? Is that talk therapy?
Yeah, all of this fits under the realm of talk therapy. Cognitive behavioral is um, addressing recurring themes and how you think about them that doesn't fit with reality. Is my understanding of it, but then again, I'm not trained in all of that.
Yeah.
For anyone who is interested in the type of dream therapy I do, they can look up Dr. Bernard Bale, who speaks considerably to dream therapy and how feelings get passed from mother to child in utero.
That's so interesting, too. I'm sure there's so much there that could be explored. The mother to child relationship in utero is fascinating. Is there one thing about the mother to child relationship in utero that comes to mind that you could share? And that's okay if not.
I'm kind of a geek for some of this stuff, so
Geek it out. I mean, I'm fascinated, so I'm sure other people would be too.
Sure. There's trying to parse my words together. There was a study done a number of years ago with mice where they exposed the adult mice to, I think, the scent of a certain flower and then would shock them. And so the mice became afraid of the scent. Their babies, even though they do not have the capacity to exchange language and their DNA did not shift, but the baby rat was afraid of the same scent and would have the same fear reaction to the scent as well. So I think that speaks to generational trauma and what we can carry without using words to describe it between parents and children. There's been more and more research about that. I think you can think of it in terms of for my family, Holocaust trauma and how that's passed down generation to generation without words being said necessarily. And then also apply that thought to America's history with slavery. And then you can think about how families who are being held in detention currently, what that does to them and how that passes on to their children who are in detention with them, and also the generations that will be born afterwards.
I'm also in the tribe, and just what that looks like over generations unsaid is something interesting to me, and it's something I'd like to learn more about. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
The trauma doesn't go away if you don't speak about it. I think it's that the feelings aren't there. I think whether or not feelings are spoken, that the people around you pick up on that regardless, especially children. They're very receptive to things. So just because you act like things don't matter, and they truly do inside you, children can sense that 100%. So it's better to address things openly.
I completely agree. And yeah, that was, when I was in third grade and my parents had ALS and breast cancer, there was so much that I didn't know that wasn't talked about, but you know, I felt I must have picked up on it because it inspired a lifelong journey with my fascination, hence this podcast. So I really do think, yeah, kids, whether you tell them, they know it, they feel it, they know when something's off or different or right or wrong. So I think you are absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Just a few more questions here.
Okay, I'm just going to take a sip of my tea, so.
Okay, please tee it up. As this is the Dying of Laughter podcast, I'm curious if there is a moment that comes to mind that was comedic, is not necessarily a word that resonates with everyone, but lighthearted or unique in some way. That's also okay if not, but I think so many death stories and grief stories focus on the heaviness and the trauma, which is understandable and a large part, but sometimes lighter moments are overlooked. So curious if anything comes to mind.
Chelsea, I'm going to go into gallows humor for you for this one.
I'm ready.
Oh, gosh. I mean, it's not something that I find settling, but my mother always used to tell me what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And, like, this idea that she took her own life, like, how do I put those two together? Like, that's a real whopper. Like, that's, I think it's awkward funny to put those two things together.
Awkward funny.
So,
I like that description.
Yeah. I think it's one of those uncomfortable, when you laugh when you're uncomfortable. It's kind of that feeling. Not so outright intentionally funny, but just makes me kind of chuckle to myself, like, this was your parting wisdom, and then you took your own life?
Yeah, how do you feel about that, or what do you make of that over the years?
I think there's truth to the statement, and also part of me wants to, light it on fire with a big bottle of gasoline in the backyard. I think there's a lot of things that can happen to one person that they overcome, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're stronger. I think it may make you a more diverse person in terms of your views and everything, but if you lose a toe, you can overcome that, but are you stronger now? I mean, do you have more physical ability now? Maybe it's not good to relate it in terms of physical stuff. I might be a little handicap prejudice. I find myself filtering myself more as we talk about this going on.
Absolutely fair. It's, like we're all navigating these conversations together, right? I mean, that's what's interesting about conversations about grief and death and illness and suicide there's no one that has the perfect words or thoughts about any of this. Sure, there's experts and there's people who are more articulate and advanced in the way they discuss this, but I think a lot of people don't know where to begin, and listening to someone like you or like me might help them feel a little safer in starting their conversations around it, because it's a little more relatable than, a grief expert with their PhD. So yeah. Just thanks for mentioning that, because I feel that too. It's like, it's all interesting. Another question I have, this is switching gears. I'm curious, have you ever cast a project that addressed suicide, and what was your reaction? And maybe you haven't, but I was curious if you had.
No, I don't think I've worked on anything that directly dealt with suicide. I don't think there's many suicide stories out there. Yes, there are suicide stories, but I think it's mainly told from the perspective of someone who has committed to suicide, and very few stories that are about the people left behind. I think Sunshine Cleaning, which I haven't seen, addresses that, and the women in the story, to my knowledge, never. They're so fearful of saying that their mom died. I wish there was a story out there of people who saw suicide and had honest conversations about it. I think seeing stuff in media makes it okay for someone to speak about it. I've done searches for books of women who have lost a mother due to suicide, and there's not a lot of literature. I came across one book that I've been trying to read, and I also know that Jane Fonda lost her mother to suicide when she was young. I've wanted to investigate how she speaks about that as well. But, Jane Fonda, this monumental figure, how often do you hear about her losing her mother? I think the documentary she did was primarily about different husbands she's had and not really about her grief.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's an interesting point about her being a monumental figure and still not knowing such a profound thing about her. So that's really interesting. And yeah, that's interesting about not having necessarily cast a project addressing suicide. I agree that I don't think the media necessarily seeks out that kind of content just yet. I mean, there's things like Barry and Dead to Me that have these darker comedic twists on death, which I enjoy as a comedic perspective because
they're great shows,
but it's not.
They're phenomenal shows.
Yes. They're phenomenal shows. I had a very small role on Barry, and I was very excited. But they're phenomenal shows, but they definitely don't address the pain of the people left behind, like you're saying. There's not a lot of shows that really go there articulately, and it is a lifelong journey. So I would be interested in seeing shows where people are grieving 10, 20, 30 years later and how it impacts their life personally. Anyone listening? Start writing.
I think Dead to Me does a beautiful job in terms of addressing the craziness and how out of whack your life can feel after losing someone.
Mm-hmm.
And it also dives into how other insecurities mix in with that. I know Christina Applegate wove in part of her own true narrative, which was her dealing with breast cancer, and how it made her feel unattractive, and how that, in the process of the story, they use that from her personal life to inform her character. And it was lovely to see how that affected her grief, her character's grief of losing her husband. Mm-hmm. I think storytelling like that is very powerful. It's not just focusing on the loss, but everything else that goes along with that, which really needs to be explored.
Yep, absolutely. I think you did a great job of articulating that. And Dead to Me, I do think is something we haven't seen before. Definitely have not seen a story like that before. And that's cool that they were able to, I mean, of course, she's such a prolific being in the entertainment community, but working with her to extrapolate those personal experiences and infuse that into the show is really special. So I'm glad they were able to do that.
Yeah. I welcome anyone who has media about survivors of suicide to let me know where it is, what I'm missing, because I can't think of anything off the top of my head right now.
Mm-hmm. Um, I'm curious, have you seen 13 Reasons Why, or what you thought about that show if you have?
Oh gosh, well there you go. That's one that totally skipped my mind. It's all kids dealing with the loss of a suicide. I did see the first season. I think it was very powerful. It's been I haven't seen it since it was released, and I haven't bothered really with the third season. Yeah, that is one about suicide.
It's interesting that some critiques it received were about glorifying the experience. And I find myself just, I just don't feel like I have enough of a voice to speak to that. But I found it interesting. And, I read a lot of articles about some people saying it was so helpful and powerful for teens, and some people saying it glorified. And, I don't really know how to write the perfect show that addresses death in a way that will impact people without glorifying. So, anyways, I'm rambling a little bit, but I don't know. It's like what they tried. They had an attempt, and it could have really helped some people, but if it didn't help others, I'm not sure what to make of that. I'm curious if you felt like it glorified the experience, or did you not see it from that lens necessarily?
I think there's no perfect media.
Mm-hmm.
I think trying something and having it not work out 100% is okay. I understand what they get about the glorification of it. I didn't come from it from that perspective, but I think it's different when you're a teenager. I think it's important to view suicide as someone who's really hurting. And I think people can make attempts without going all the way as a signaling that they need a lot of help. And it has to be viewed as that. And that's not something to be messed around with. Maybe that's the glorifying, that it gives attention to what is considered a cruel act. I'm no expert on this. I didn't take offense with the show, but I'm not the one that it would particularly offend. I don't think it should have gone on as long as it did, though.
Right there, that's another story. I think it's done, right? It's on. This is its last season that just came out, I want to say.
Yeah. The book only covered the first season, and then they started writing their own stuff, much like Game of Thrones did.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. Yeah, that was a show. I auditioned for it, I think, like 14 times or something, and now it's.
Oh wow!
Yeah, now it was definitely one of the ones I thought I would be on, but yeah, it's over, and yeah, that's just an interesting actor tangent moment. You're like, oh, that's interesting.
Was it because you said that you would make yourself a local hire for it or something?
Yeah, it shot where I'm from, so
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now there's a lot of people saying they're local everywhere. That's a whole other story. Bless everyone who was in 13 Reasons Why. Yeah, good for them. And I think especially season 1 was really powerful. And I haven't seen the last season either, last couple. But yeah, I'm interested to see what kind of media comes out in the future that addresses death and grief. So we will see, Emily. We will see.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what people come up with. I think it's an infrequently told story.
And so, like, moving forward, what impact do you hope to make as a casting director, or what projects are you excited about to hopefully work on in the future? I know that sounds really deep. I mean, there doesn't have to be like a profound, necessarily one size fits all answer to that, but just, yeah, curious about your interests and what you're looking forward to.
I particularly enjoy working on coming of age stories, where you have children becoming adults and learning more about themselves. And I think it's creatively interesting. I think the stories resonate so profoundly with the audience, whether they're at the teenage age or beyond that. So if I had my pick of stuff to work on, I would love to focus on coming of age stories.
I love that. Have you seen The Babysitter's Club?
I have. I watched the first episode of it the other day when I was baking. I was like, this is really, really cute. And they're doing women's voices in a really smart way, where these girls are like cognizant of one, young girls viewing women cognizant of one another. So cute and very well done. And I think that the part of me that responded the most to it was the bit. I really liked how the girls were speaking so eloquently to one another, but still in like teenage language, and they were cognizant of each other's feelings. And I think viewing media where people are cognizant of each other's feelings promotes that within the community. So I applaud the Babysitters Club for having these girls be real and not just super fluffy. And it's a real change from the media that I had growing up as a kid.
How cute were those kids? I just watched the first episode too. I want to watch more, but I was like, these girls are so cute. This story is so cute. I was just like, my heart is bursting the whole time.
They found some really cute young girls for it, who I think have a lot of self-awareness, and I imagine they know what Babysitters Club means to, or they were well educated on what Babysitters Club means to people of different generations, and they're doing justice to it.
Shout out to Ann M. Martin. Good old Ann. You know, I hadn't thought about her in quite some time, and what better time than to think about her than quarantine? Shout out to Ann.
Oh yeah,
she made a great book or two in her day. Thank you, Ann M. Martin.
That or the second season of Tiger King. I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, wait, when does that come out? I need to watch this.
I don't think it's a thing. I want it though.
Oh, you just gave me so much false hope. My heart just like shattered on the floor, Emily. I need the second season of Tiger King. You know they're going to find a way to do something. There's got to be some spin-off of something related to that. I don't know.
They're doing a movie.
They are?
Yeah, I think Kate McKinnon's going to play Carol Baskin.
Oh, you're right. I knew that, and then I didn't know that. It was a piece of knowledge that was in my brain and then no longer decided to stay until you reminded me. Oh, bless Kate McKinnon's heart. That is just going to be the treat of the century. Thanks, Kate. Shout out to Kate. Oh.
Yeah, she's got some cool stuff coming up.
Why is she so amazing? Why is she so amazing, Kate? I don't know why I said that like in a tragic way. Like good for Kate. Thank God for Kate. I'm excited for her. Okay, what else? I think I asked that. Yeah, what's your favorite part about the casting process? It's so cliche, but I also find people have really interesting answers. So curious what comes to mind for you.
I'll steal what I think other people frequently say. It's like, one, you're contributing to building a story, but it's also kind of fun to sit back and look at it as if it was a coloring book. And so each actor is a different crayon. and finding the crayons that go best together to tell the right story. That can be really fun.
Emily Cook's Crayons, a brand coming out in 2021. I love that. I love that description, that imagery. I love it. Okay. Oh, last question I would have for you is, what is one thing that nobody knows about you? And I know you mentioned in your form about a music video. Do you wish to speak to that? Because that sounded really cool.
I will say people do know about that because that is something I tell people. But you,
just a cute fun
fact.
Do you want to talk about it? Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I could so address the fun fact. A fun fact about me is that I have been in 3 music videos, the first one of which I was only a year old, and it appeared on MTV.
Love.
Eating spinach.
That is so specific. I love that.
Yeah.
I love random fun facts about people. It's always something that you would never necessarily think, and you're like, wow, that is a fun fact. What is one last question I've said for the 50th time, but is there one resource that comes to mind that helped you grieve or cope with grief in some way? Is there a book, film, podcast, something that comes to mind you care to share? And if not, that's okay too.
There weren't resources for me when I lost my mother. I think there's still a limited amount of resources for children who lost a parent due to suicide. I wish there were more. I've not come across them. I think our house is in Los Angeles is, from what I know, my experience with them is limited, but I would say they're probably a wonderful resource. And I appreciate the work that you do with them, Chelsea. I think that's great. I think they take the way for children to have an open environment to speak about their grief.
Thanks, Emily. Appreciate that. Yeah, and I know what you mean. There's limited resources even still. So thanks for shouting out our house. I think that's everything. Before we do our sign off, is anything else you wanted to add? Last words of wisdom?
Last words of wisdom. I could give a summation.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. I think through our conversation, one point that I've been hitting on repeatedly is the idea to address your feelings in the moment and that your feelings are valid. And it's important to find a community that understands that. And it may be hard to find those people, but once you do, it's solid gold.
I love it. Well said. Well, thank you so much, Emily. I really appreciate you being here and sharing more openly about your mother. And it was nice to learn a little bit more about your journey. And I'm sure it will be very inspiring to other people who have lost someone in a similar way to you, as well as other people who've experienced other kinds of loss. So I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Chelsea, for having me and giving me a platform to speak about something that I think frequently goes untalked about.
Well, thank you, Emily. This was, it's weird that I want to say uplifting. That's not like the right word, but I feel connected, and I feel like appreciative of learning more about suicide and more about dream therapy and the other things you mentioned. So thank you so much.
I hope you have a great rest of your day too, Chelsea.
Thanks, Emily.